The year is 1964. Beatlemania is all the rage in North America. The Fab Four entertained a TV audience of 73 million Americans during their first live appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th of that year. Not even 6 months later, a troubled young man wearing a mop-top style Beatle wig and a mask held up a bank in North York outside Toronto, sparking a chain of events detailed in the new book, The Beatle Bandit, a serial bank robber's deadly heist, a cross-country manhunt, and the insanity plea that shook a nation. It's the latest from true crime author Nate Hendley. Welcome to the CityNews bookshelf, Nate.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on.
All right. You've written many books in the true crime genre, Nate. What made you take on this particular tale?
Well, it's a somewhat roundabout story. I actually knew absolutely nothing about Beatle Bandit, and I was doing a live presentation in pre-COVID days at a library, and I was approached by a lawyer named Paul Truster, who said, well, I've got a great story for you, and hear me out. I was a little wary at first because I get approached all the time by people with great stories that often turn out to be not so great or kooky. He continued to send me information, said he grew up in this neighborhood, this bizarre bank robbery, and he had been sort of fascinated by this case for years, had collected all sorts of information. We met in person. He gave me a great spiel. I thought, wow, okay, this actually has potential. And he sealed the deal by giving me an entire plastic tub full of information, like the entire 1,000-page court transcript, all public record, police documents, memos, the confession of the Beatle Bandit, Matthew Carey Smith, government documents, all this stuff, like mana to, a true crime writer. I pitched the book to Dundurn Press. They loved it, and the book ensued. So that's the sort of roundabout tale of how this came to be.
So that's kind of handy that a lot of the preliminary research, kind of the ditch digging of the book was already done for you.
Absolutely. I have to credit Paul 100% because, as I said, to be perfectly honest, I knew nothing about this crime. And I'm a little embarrassed by that because I think I try to keep up to date on Toronto historic crimes. And just having this material, because my previous book was called The Boy and the Bicycle, and it was about a wrongful conviction in Toronto in the 50s. And trying to get information for that was like pulling teeth. And I only got information because of a fellow crime writer who sent me a bunch of police, documents, memos, court material, etc. I received nothing for that book from Freedom of Information requests to police reports. So it was just incredible having this info. And I augmented it with my own research and interviews with a lot of the people who were involved in the case.
So let's talk about the Beatle Bandit. He's a troubled, even perhaps disturbed young man named Matthew Carey Smith. Yes. What was wrong with him?
Well, he had been diagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia, but his father had noted that he'd always been eccentric. He was born in 1940 in Winnipeg. Father was a journalist turned businessman. His mother was a teacher, and she developed schizophrenia when Matthew was quite young. This is very disturbing to him. He saw his mother, breaking down mentally. So he had always been sort of eccentric, not very sociable, prone to strange moods and idiosyncratic behavior. He did manage, like a lot of people with psychiatric problems, that this wasn't a 24/7 condition, that he managed to have periods of lucidity. He joined the Royal Canadian Navy and at first served quite well, but then his behavior deteriorated. He managed to get out of the Navy, and he fell into this weird pattern he moved back to Toronto and fell into a weird pattern of working legitimate jobs and then doing criminal activity at the same time. He stole cars. He led police on this bizarre police chase. He stole a vehicle, tried to ram a police cruiser, and then got chased. For that crime, he was taken to court and told to get evaluated at a psychiatric clinic, and they concluded he had schizophrenia like his mother. And he proceeded to start robbing banks and other behavior. It's a bit of a mystery because at the time, and I believe still today, there's no chemical test for things like schizophrenia. But the psychiatrists and psychologists who examined him, and there are quite a few, all concluded that they believed he was either schizophrenic or very close to it.
Now, this is going to sound like an odd question, but
Mhm.
why a Beatle wig of all things?
Okay. Yes, just to set the scene, this is July 24th, 1964. Matthew Carey Smith decides to rob a bank in North York. And for his disguise, he'd always disguised himself. This was his third bank robbery. And he wears a Charles de Gaulle mask, president of France. And as far as can be told, he wore the Beatle wig just simply because the Beatles were the big thing at the time. He thought it kind of was a good disguise, and it turned out it was. And there was no enormous reasoning behind it. Like a lot of things he did, it was difficult to perceive a logical intent. I've seen photos of these Beatle wigs, and bear in mind, they were like everywhere. Summer of 1964, retailers across Toronto, well, across North America, were selling these ridiculous kind of long-haired Beatle toupees, look like your favorite Beatle. And this was the big thing. Harold Ballard, who owned the Toronto Maple Leafs, wore one to talk to fans outside the Gardens who were lined up to buy tickets for a Beatle concert. So these are very, very common. So he wears this Beatle wig, and he also wears a T-shirt that says CKEY Good Guys. And this is a reference to a radio station that had the slogan Good Guys. And that was his idea of a joke, that he thought it was sort of amusing to hold up a bank with a gun wearing a T-shirt that said Good Guys. So there was no real logic behind the Beatle wig, although that turned into, as soon as this bank robbery occurred, the press immediately dubbed him the Beatle Bandit, and that kind of stuck.
It really did, and if you remember for anything, it might be that Beatle wig, even though it's a very small part of the story.
Exactly.
Now, one of the major characters of the book, if you want to call him a character, because they are real people, was Jack Blank, who tried to intervene in that robbery. And you spend quite a bit of time with his backstory. What do we know about him?
Absolutely. Jack Blank was a fascinating guy. He had been born in what is now Ukraine, Jewish heritage, moves to Canada, very military-minded guy that he had joined. He was a member of both the Canadian Army and later the Israeli Army, and he was constantly signing up. This is a guy who served, he joined the military before Canada declared war in World War II. So he served 1939 to 1945, then he served in the Israeli War of Independence, then he joined up again for the Korean War, just really, really into sort of the military, very military-minded, knew how to use guns. And he was at the bank when Matthew Carey Smith bursts in with his rifle. Jack Blank is appalled by this. Why isn't anyone stopping this guy? And Jack Blank at the time knew something. Here's a little interesting historic tidbit for listeners. Canadian banks in the 60s stocked revolvers, and they were staff were expected to use these in case of robbery. And Jack Blank knew this. He said, "Give me a gun, give me a gun." An accountant named Carmen Lamb, who I interviewed, went into the bank, got a pistol, and Jack Blank grabs it from his hands, runs after the Beatle Bandit, and they start shooting it out in this suburban street. This is a quiet suburban residential neighborhood, and bang, 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 there's this massive gunfight going on. I can take it from there. There's a lot more to it. Jack Blank is central, absolutely, to this whole story. And controversy still rages about, brave man or foolhardy. It's a little open to interpretation.
What is the sort of the legacy of the Beatle Bandit? And you kind of touched upon it there, that in those days that they still kept revolvers in banks. Did that change as a result of this case?
It didn't change directly, but within a few years, revolvers had been removed from banks. That I did some research, and the CIBC Bank, which is Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, that's the bank that Matthew Carey Smith robbed Bathurst Manor. They stopped stocking revolvers in, I believe, 1973. I'd have to check my notes. But pretty much by the mid 70s, banks no longer stocked revolvers. This was one of the reasons, but believe it or not, this wasn't the only case of a patron getting killed by a bank revolver. That there also had been a case in the 50s where a bank was robbed. The manager grabbed a gun and accidentally shot one of his own staff. So this was one of the reasons, but not the only reason. And there's numerous things that came out of this case, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. There was the issue of the insanity pleas, gun control, and the death penalty.
What does this case tell us about mental illness and crime? What did we learn from this, or how did this change things moving forward?
Sure. Well, there's a very sad footnote to the story, which Matt Smith, that is the name of Matthew Carey Smith's father, is named Matt Smith, does a series of interviews with Scott Young, who's a newspaper man, the father of Neil Young, by the way, rockstar Neil Young. And he makes it very clear, in Matt Smith's opinion, his son had been diagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia in 1961. Was basically told, go to outpatient therapy and whatever. He wasn't hospitalized, no real strict medication or anything. And he went to outpatient therapy, then walked away, and no one bothered following up on it. So his father was very upset. And in his opinion, if his son had received more interventionist therapy in 1961, maybe none of these crimes would have happened. That's again speculative, but that was a theme that was picked up by a lot of papers saying that 1961, Matthew Carey Smith is diagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia, but they decide he's not a menace, he's not dangerous, so whatever. And they had this sort of hands-off approach. So that was one of the key things that came out of it, was a very sad thing that if there was some sort of stricter medical regime that he was put under, maybe he could have been, treated and led a relatively normal life. We don't know.
And finally, Nate, what do you hope people get out of this particular book?
A couple things. I think just the story itself is somewhat astonishing. I never heard it. There are multiple twists and turns that I haven't even gotten into because they're so complicated, and some of them are so. Let me put it this way. Some of the book reads like a Hollywood movie script, and a not very believable Hollywood movie script, except this stuff actually happened. It's real. I hope people get a good story out of it, but also a sense of compassion for both the Jack Blanks family, who suffered terribly, for the Smith family, who suffered terribly as well because of the actions of Matthew Carey Smith, and also a notion of the issues of the day. Like, this became a huge issue. The case became front and center for the debate about the death penalty. And that became a huge part of, the issue about the death penalty became central to this case. There were issues about insanity pleas. There's a whole section in the book where I explain the difference between legal insanity and medical insanity, and also the issue of gun control. Because again, just to reiterate that we tend to think of these things as a modern issue. Well, guess what? We were arguing about it in the 60s. So I hope that's what people get out of it.
All right. The name of the book is The Beatle Bandit, a serial bank robber's deadly heist, a cross-country manhunt, and the insanity plea that shook a nation. It's available from Dundurn Press. My thanks to author Nate Hendley.
Thank you very much, John. Appreciate it.